17-year-old Elizabeth stood trembling in the center of the hallowed grove, the air thick with the scent of pine and the judgment of 300 wolves. This was Shatter Day, the moment of her first shift. She could feel the gaze of Doris, the lead matriarch, drilling into her, cold and expectant. But as the moon reached its peak, the snap Elizabeth felt wasn't her bones shifting into a wolf's frame. It was a searing white-hot explosion from within her marrow. Instead of fur, her skin began to glow with a terrifying molten radiance. The grass beneath her feet charred to ash. "No," Doris whispered, her voice cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. "This is not a shift. This is a sickness." Elizabeth reached out for her mother, but Lisa was held back by pack guards, her face a mask of silent agony. The pack members recoiled, their faces shifting from confusion to a collective, sharpened disgust. "The bloodline has been poisoned," Doris declared, her voice rising with an alpha's command that made the very trees vibrate. "The goddess didn't give us a warrior. She gave us a curse. I, Doris of Grey Ridge, formally sever this stain from our history." As the exile stone was cast at Elizabeth's feet, a physical weight crushed her chest. The communal bond, the psychic thread that connected her to everyone she loved didn't just break. It shattered like glass, tearing her spirit apart. She collapsed, skin blistering with a fire she couldn't control, as the only family she ever knew turned their backs in unison. "Hey, quick question, how are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Helps more than you know. Alright, thank you. Now let's get back to the story. The air in the Grey Ridge territory didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, like the breath of a predator holding still before a strike. I stood in the center of the hallowed grove, my boots sinking into the frost-covered soil. Around me, 300 members of the pack formed a perfect, suffocating circle. Today was my 17th birthday. My Shatter Day. In our world, this is the moment of truth. You either shift into the powerful wolf you were born to be, or you remain human, a late bloomer at best or a dud at worst. But as the clock struck midnight and the moon climbed to its zenith, I felt something that no textbook or elder had ever described. It wasn't the sound of bones cracking into a new shape. It was the sound of a furnace door swinging open inside my soul. "Elizabeth, begin the transition," Doris commanded. She stood on the high ledge, her silhouette sharp against the silver sky. She wore heavy, dark furs that made her look twice her size, and her iron jewelry clinked with every micro-movement. To the pack, she was the matriarch. To me, she was the woman who had spent years looking at me like I was a smudge on a clean window. I reached for the wolf. I reached for the fur, the claws, the predatory instinct. But instead, a white-hot agony surged from my chest to my fingertips. My skin didn't sprout hair. It began to glow. A low, humming vibration shook the ground beneath me, and suddenly, the frost on the grass didn't just melt, it evaporated into a thick, choking steam. "What is happening?" a voice whispered from the crowd. I looked down at my hands. They were translucent, pulsing with a liquid, molten light. The heat was unbearable. I gasped, and a small puff of actual flame escaped my lips. "She's burning." Maria, a girl I had grown up with, cried out, her eyes wide with terror. Doris didn't move to help. She didn't call for a healer. Instead, she took a calculated step forward, her face twisting into a mask of theatrical horror. "Stay back. No one touches her," she bellowed. Her voice was laced with a specialized frequency, an alpha's command that forces the brain to obey. "This is no shift. This is a contagion. A cursed heat that will consume everything it touches. Doris Snow. My mother, Lisa, tried to break through the line of guards. Her face was pale, her posture desperate. She's just different. It's not a disease. It's a gift we don't understand yet. But Doris was faster. She knew that fear was the most effective tool in her arsenal. She looked at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of our neighbors, our friends. Look at her. Does that look like a wolf to you? Does that look like the blood of Grey Ridge? We are a pack of purity, of strength, of tradition. If we allow this fever to stay, it will infect our pups. It will rot our lineage from the inside out. This is the danger of groupthink. At that moment, I watched people who had shared meals with me and people who had hugged me only yesterday start to nod. They didn't check the facts. They didn't ask questions. They let Doris's fear become their own because it was easier to be part of the angry crowd than to be the one person standing up for the truth. One by one, their faces hardened. The empathy was gone, replaced by a collective, sharpened hunger for purity. The purity code is clear, Doris shouted, her voice ringing with a terrifying authority. That which is not a wolf is a threat. Elizabeth of Grey Ridge, you are hereby stripped of your name, your rank, and your home. You are a cursed hybrid, and your presence is an act of war against our kind. She picked up a jagged black stone called the Exiled stone and threw it. It struck the ground at my feet, shattering. Hunt her, Doris commanded. Drive the sickness from our woods. The change in the pack was instantaneous. People I loved shifted. Dozens of wolves, gray and black and brown, snarled in unison. The sound was like a landslide of bone and muscle. I turned and ran. I didn't have claws to fight back. I only had this fire, this curse that made my lungs feel like they were full of boiling gold. I tore through the underbrush, the branches catching on my leather tunic. Behind me, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of 100 paws haunted my heels. I could hear Maria's shadow step behind me and the heavy breathing of the pack's strongest warriors. They weren't hunting a predator. They were hunting a girl who just wanted to belong. I reached the northern border, where the forest gives way to the great chasm. The air here was freezing, the wind whipping off the ice-covered peaks, but the snow hissed as it touched my skin. I was a living torch in a world of ice. I skidded to a halt at the very edge of the frozen falls. 1,000 feet of jagged rocks and churning icy water waited below. I turned around, my back to the abyss. The wolves emerged from the trees, forming a semicircle. Doris walked through them, now shifted into her massive, iron-gray wolf form. She didn't look like a mother or a leader. She looked like an executioner. Jump, her voice echoed in my mind through the packlink I was no longer a part of. Save us the trouble of tearing you apart. Die as a human or die as a monster. Either way, you are gone. I looked at the wolves. I looked for a spark of the friends I once knew. But groupthink had won. Their eyes were vacant, fixed only on the stain Doris told them to erase. I am not a mistake, I whispered, though my voice trembled. I looked at the moon one last time, took a deep breath of the freezing air that my body was turning into steam, and I stepped backward. The wind caught my hair. The world turned upside down. As I fell into the darkness of the frozen falls, the last thing I saw was Doris standing at the edge, her eyes cold and victorious. She thought she had extinguished the fire. She had no idea she had just given it the air it needed to roar. The freezing water of the falls didn't kill me. It felt like needles of ice piercing my skin, but the moment I submerged, that internal furnace within me roared into a protective shell. I didn't drown. I boiled the water around me until I drifted, unconscious, onto a jagged bank miles downstream. I woke to the smell of lavender and ozone. I wasn't on the rocks anymore. I was lying on a bed of shimmering moss inside a cavern that glowed with a soft, pulsating violet light. "The fever has finally broken," a voice whispered. It was melodic, filled with a maternal warmth I thought I had lost forever. I sat up, my muscles aching. Standing by a stone hearth was Lisa. She looked older than she did in my memories, her hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes held the same fierce kindness. "Mom," croaked. "Not your mother by blood, Elizabeth, but by soul," she said, stepping into the light. "I was exiled 10 years ago for the same reason you were. Doris calls it a curse, because she cannot control it. But here in the Ether Heights we call it an awakening." Lisa spent the next few days healing my spirit. She explained that the Grey Ridge Pack had been built on a lie. Thousands of years ago, wolves weren't just predators. They were protected by phoenix goddesses, celestial beings who maintained the balance of nature. The wolves provided the strength, and the phoenixes provided the light. But over time, alphas grew greedy. They feared a power they couldn't bite or scratch. They began to hunt the phoenixes, forcing them into hiding and rebranding their divine fire as a hybrid disease. "You aren't a broken wolf, Elizabeth," Lisa said, her voice echoing off the crystal walls. "You are the return of the sun. You are a phoenix goddess, and your fire is meant to purify, not destroy." As my strength returned, Lisa led me higher into the peaks, where the air was thin and the gravity felt different. "You aren't the only one the world tried to break," she remarked, pointing toward a jagged plateau. "That was when I met Edward. He didn't walk, he prowled. He was massive, his shoulders broader than any alpha I had ever seen. His eyes were the color of a thunderstorm, and as he approached, the very air around him began to crackle with electricity. He was a dire wolf hybrid, a relic of a primal lineage that Doris's purity code had tried to erase centuries ago. He saw the orange glow of my skin and snarled, his chest heaving. "A fire starter in my mountains." He growled, his voice like grinding stones. "I'm not looking for a fight," I said, but my nerves flared, and a wave of heat rolled off me. Edward didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth, and instead of a howl, a blast of freezing storm breath, a literal gale of frost and lightning shot toward me. Instinct took over. I threw my hands up, and a wall of pure golden flame erupted from my palms. The collision was deafening. Steam hissed and exploded around us, obscuring the world in a white mist. We stood there, fire against frost, neither of us backing down. "Enough," Lisa shouted, her voice amplified by the cavern. The mist cleared. Edward was panting, his eyes fixed on mine. The hatred in his gaze began to melt into something else. He looked at my glowing hands, then down at his own arms, which were etched with jagged scars from lightning strikes he had endured while mastering his own power. "You're like me," he whispered, the thunder in his voice softening. In the weeks that followed, the Ether Heights became my training ground, and Edward became my shadow. We were two broken halves of a forgotten history. One evening, as we sat overlooking the clouds, the wind picked up, turning the air bitterly cold. I felt my internal heat spike, a reflex I still couldn't control. I pulled away from him, afraid I would leave blisters on his skin. "Don't," Edward said, reaching out to catch my hand. "I'll burn you, Edward. Doris said I'm a danger to anyone I touch." Edward didn't let go. He pulled my hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. I waited for the smell of scorched leather, for the cry of pain. But it never came. Edward closed his eyes, a small, genuine smile breaking through his rugged exterior. For the first time in 10 years, he murmured, "I'm not cold. Your heat doesn't burn me, Elizabeth. It warms me. Feels like home." In that moment, amidst the silence of the peaks, the cursed hybrid disappeared. It wasn't a mistake. I was a light. And for the first time since my exile, I realized that I didn't want to just survive. I wanted to fly. While I was discovering my wings in the clouds, a dark winter was settling over the Grey Ridge pack. Doris hadn't stopped at my exile. Fear is a hungry beast. Once you feed it a victim, it only wants more. Deep in the ether heights, Lisa and I watched the valley through the scrying pool, a basin of enchanted water that reflected the truth of the world below. What we saw made my heart turn to ash. Doris had institutionalized her hatred. She had drafted the purity census, a decree that required every wolf to undergo a gene scan by the pack's elders. Anyone whose shift wasn't standard, those with rare fur colors, smaller statures, or unique elemental traces, was being rounded up. "Look," Lisa whispered, pointing at the shimmering water. I saw Nora, the youngest of the pack. She was only 12, a sweet girl who had always been quiet. As she shifted, her fur didn't turn gray or brown. It shimmered like literal quartz, a crystal wolf. She was beautiful, a living gemstone. But in the eyes of Doris's guards, she was a biological error. I watched as they dragged her away from her crying parents, throwing her into a damp limestone cellar at the edge of the territory. Then came Maria. She was a shadow wolf, capable of stepping through darkness. She was a natural scout, a protector. But Doris had labeled her abilities deceptive and unwolf-like. "She's clearing the board," Edward said, his voice a low thunder behind me. He stood with his arms crossed, his thunderstorm eyes narrowed at the pool. "Doris isn't just looking for purity, Elizabeth. She's removing anyone she can't predict. Anyone with a gift she doesn't possess is a threat to her ego." This was the scandal of Grey Ridge. Doris was secretly using dark empath tactics, pretending to care about the pack's safety while systematically dismantling the families that made the pack strong. She told the elders that these hybrids were the reason the winter was so harsh, the reason the prey was scarce. She gave them a scapegoat so they wouldn't look at her own failing leadership. Suddenly, the image in the water shifted. A young wolf scout, breathless and bruised, was scrambling up the treacherous hidden path toward our sanctuary. "They're coming for the dwellers next," the scout gasped as he reached the cave entrance an hour later. It was one of the few who still remembered Lisa. "Doris is calling it the final cleansing. She's going to execute the captives at the next full moon to reset the pack's luck." My fire flared, the heat cracking the stone floor beneath my boots. "She's going to kill children for being born with different fur. She's going to kill them because they represent a future she can't control," Lisa corrected. I looked at Edward. The air around him began to swirl with localized wind, his dire wolf instincts screaming for a hunt. "We can't just watch anymore," he said, his hand finding mine. His touch was the only thing that kept my flames from consuming the room. "If I go back now, I'm just a target," I said, the old shame trying to claw its way back into my throat. "No," Lisa said, her eyes flashing with a divine light. "If you go back now, you go back as a goddess. But first you have to realize that you aren't fighting for yourself anymore. You are fighting for Nora, for Maria, and for every wolf who has been told they are less than because they are more than." Educational note. This is where we learn about moral courage. It's easy to be brave when everyone is cheering for you. It's a different kind of bravery to stand up against your own community when they've been brainwashed by a charismatic leader. That night, the Ether Heights didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a staging ground. I spent hours in the wind, practicing my flight, my fire turning from a frantic orange to a focused, piercing gold. The drama was no longer about a girl who couldn't shift. It was about a queen who refused to let her people burn. As Edward and I prepared our descent, I realized the stakes were higher than just my life. If we failed, the very soul of the wolf species, their diversity and their heart would be lost forever under Doris's iron heel. "Are you ready?" Edward asked, his massive frame silhouetted by the rising moon. "I'm not just ready," I said, my wings unfurling for the first time in full splendor, casting a glow that lit up the entire mountain range. "I'm the storm Doris never saw coming." The ether heights wasn't just a place of height. It was a place of pressure. Up here, where the oxygen was thin and the wind could strip the skin from your bones, there was no room for self-doubt. To save the others, I had to stop seeing my fire as a glitch and start seeing it as a language. "You're fighting yourself again, Elizabeth," Edward's voice rumbled through the mist. We were standing on the jagged Needle Peak. He was in his human form, but his presence was so massive he seemed to take up all the space on the plateau. I was trying to hover to keep my wings steady, but every time I thought about Doris, every time I remembered the look of disgust on the pack's faces, my flames would flicker and sputter, sending me crashing back to the rock. "They called me a disease, Edward," I said, my voice cracking. "How do I lead people who think I'm a biohazard?" Edward stepped toward me. He didn't flinch at the heat radiating off my skin. He reached out and gripped my shoulders. "Doris used groupthink to make them see a monster. You have to use truth to make them see a leader. But a leader doesn't shake. A leader is the anchor." He began to push me. Literally. We engaged in a high-intensity sparring match that lasted for hours. He would summon localized gales of freezing wind, forcing me to use my heat to create thermal lift. It was a dance of physics and willpower. Educational note: this is where we learn about emotional intelligence, EQ. Elizabeth had to learn that her fire was directly linked to her fear. In moments of high stress, our bodies go into fight or flight. For Elizabeth, that meant burning everything. To master her power, she had to master her internal state, staying calm in the center of the storm. "Focus on the why, not the who," Edward commanded as he swept my legs out from under me. "Don't fight Doris. Fight for Nora. Fight for Maria." The shift was instantaneous. My fire changed from a chaotic smoky orange to a laser-focused, brilliant gold. I didn't just stand up. I ascended. My wings snapped open, casting a light so bright it pierced through the heavy clouds. But our training was cut short. A frantic howl echoed from the pass below. "They found us." Maria's voice came through a mental link she had managed to forge through the shadows. Doris had sent her purity guards, a specialized unit of black-furred wolves trained to hunt hybrids. They were coming up the mountain with silver-tipped arrows and specialized dampening nets. They didn't want to talk. They wanted to sanitize the mountain. Action sequence. The chase was cinematic. Edward shifted into his massive direwolf form, his fur crackling with blue electricity as he bounded over the crevasses, taking out the lead scouts with shocks of kinetic energy. Took to the sky. From above, I saw the guards closing in on the hidden cave where the younger outcasts were hiding. Dive. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a falling star. I didn't hit them with fire. Instead, I used a purification flare, a massive burst of light that didn't burn their skin but blinded their sensors and knocked the aggression right out of their nervous systems. It was a non-lethal show of absolute dominance. The guards scrambled back, terrified by the angel of death descending from the sun. "Go back to Doris," I shouted, my voice vibrating with the power of the ether. "Tell her the cursed one is coming home." And tell her she better start looking for a new place to hide." As the guards retreated, the younger hybrids Nora and Maria ran out from the cave. They looked at me not with fear, but with awe. You're like a goddess," Nora whispered, her crystal fur catching the remnants of my glow. I landed softly, the heat under my skin now a gentle hum. I looked at Edward, who stood guard at the edge of the cliff. We had the power. We had the skill. But most importantly, we finally had the heart. "We leave at dawn," I said. "The purity purge ends tomorrow." The Grey Ridge Valley was choked with a thick, unnatural fog as we approached. It wasn't a weather pattern. It was the physical manifestation of the pack's collective anxiety. In the center of the village, Doris had erected a purity stage made of cold, jagged basalt. Nora and Maria were there, chained to the stone. Around them, the pack members stood in a tight, fearful circle. They weren't cheering for an execution. They were silent, their eyes darting around as if looking for a reason to stop what was happening, but trapped by the groupthink Doris had perfected. "Today we cut out the rot." Doris's voice boomed. She stood over Nora, her iron-gray wolf form towering and predatory. "We return to the old ways. To the pure ways." She raised a massive silver-clawed paw to strike the final blow. But the sky didn't just brighten. It ignited. A pillar of golden fire pierced the fog, striking the center of the stage with the force of a falling star. The shockwave sent the guards tumbling back, but it didn't harm a hair on Nora or Maria's heads. As the smoke cleared, I descended. My wings were no longer just feathers and light. They were 10 feet of living, breathing sun. My posture was regal, my feet barely touching the scorched earth. Beside me, the ground shook as Edward landed, his dire wolf form crackling with a blue-white electrical storm that turned the air to ozone. "Step away from them, Doris," I said. My voice wasn't a scream. It was a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of every wolf present. "The abomination returns." Doris snarled, trying to rally the pack. "Kill her. Protect your bloodline." But the guards hesitated. They looked at the girl they had chased off a cliff, and they saw a goddess. They looked at Edward and saw the primal strength of their own ancestors. Doris, sensing her control slipping, lunged at me. She was a flurry of iron-gray fur and teeth. But I didn't meet her with violence. This is where the educational lesson became a weapon. I used the mirror of truth. As she attacked, I didn't strike back. I simply unfurled my wings and wrapped us both in a sphere of golden light. Within that sphere, Doris's dark empathy had nowhere to hide. Her own mind was forced to face the truth she had suppressed for decades. "You aren't protecting the pack, Doris," I whispered, our eyes locking as she tried to tear at my throat. "You're protecting your own fear. You hate the hybrids because your own grandmother was one of us. You spent your life burying your own fire, and it turned into cold, bitter iron." The sphere of light projected her memories onto the fog for the whole pack to see. They saw a young Doris, hiding a glowing birthmark on her shoulder. They saw her betraying her own sister to prove her purity. The silence that followed was absolute. The purity movement didn't end with a bang. It ended with a collective realization of the lie. "Hey, I was doing it for the pack," Doris whimpered, shifting back into her human form. She looked small. She looked fragile. Her posture, once rigid with authority, collapsed. I stepped toward Nora and Maria, the golden heat from my hands melting their silver chains like they were made of wax. "The pack doesn't need to be pure to be strong," I said, turning to face the 300 wolves. "Needs to be whole. Every gift, the crystal, the shadow, the storm is a piece of our survival. To cut them out is to bleed ourselves dry." Edward stood at my side, his storm breath fading into a gentle breeze. One by one, the pack members dropped their heads not in submission to a new tyrant, but in apology. The siege was over. Not through blood, but through the overwhelming power of empathy. The silence in the clearing was heavier than the fog had ever been. Doris sat on the cold stone of the stage, her human form trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden public exposure of her own hypocrisy. The pack members, who had spent months following her purity code out of fear, were now looking at her as if they were seeing a stranger for the first time. But the reckoning was only beginning. "You speak of purity, Doris," I said, my wings slowly retracting until they were a soft golden glow behind my shoulders. "But you didn't exile me to save the pack. You exiled me to save your secret." I turned to the crowd. Does anyone know why the purity census never applied to Doris's own family? A murmur went through the crowd. Suddenly Maria, using her shadow-stepping ability, appeared on the stage holding an old leather-bound ledger she had retrieved from Doris's private quarters during the chaos. "It's all here," Maria announced, her voice steady. "The birth records Doris tried to burn. Her grandmother wasn't just a rare wolf. She was a phoenix kin, just like Elizabeth. Doris has been suppressing her own internal fire for 50 years. She hated us because we were brave enough to show the world the very thing she was too ashamed to be." The plot twist. The crowd gasped as Doris's own daughter stepped forward. She reached up and pulled back the collar of her tunic, revealing a small glowing mark, a faint ember pulsing in her skin. She was a latent hybrid. Doris hadn't been trying to cleanse the pack. She had been trying to create a world where her daughter's imperfection would be erased by force before it could ever be discovered. The reckoning. This is where the educational value of the story peaks. We see the consequences of internalized shame. Doris wasn't born a villain. She was a victim of her own ancestors' trauma who chose to pass that pain on to the next generation. Suddenly, the air shimmered with an iridescent light. The divine guardians, Elaine and Laurie, appeared at the edge of the grove. They didn't look like wolves or humans. They looked like beings made of starlight and ancient wisdom. "The test of the Grey Ridge is complete," Elaine spoke, her voice like the ringing of 1,000 silver bells. "A pack that hunts its own lights will eventually find itself in total darkness. You chose to follow a leader who fed you fear because it made you feel safe. But true safety comes from the strength of the many, not the purity of the few." Laurie stepped toward me, her eyes reflecting the phoenix fire on my own. "Elizabeth, you have done what few could. You returned to a place of pain not with a sword, but with a mirror. You have shown them that their cursed members are actually their greatest protectors." Doris looked up at the guardians, her eyes filling with tears. For the first time, the old world authority was gone. She wasn't the matriarch anymore. She was a woman who had spent her entire life at war with herself. "What happens to me now?" Doris whispered. "You will not be exiled," I said, stepping forward. The pack held its breath. They expected me to demand her head or her banishment. "Exile is what you did because you were afraid. We are building something better. You will stay. You will work. You will help Nora and Maria build the first school for hybrid gifts. You will spend the rest of your days learning to love the fire you tried so hard to put out." The pack let out a collective breath, not a cheer, but a sigh of relief. The cycle of vengeance was broken. The purity movement was dead, and in its place, something authentic and human began to grow. The snow didn't melt away overnight, but the cold no longer felt like a threat. Felt like a canvas. In the weeks following the fall of the purity movement, the Grey Ridge territory underwent a transformation that no one could have predicted. We didn't just rebuild the pack. We redefined what a pack was. I stood on the high ledge where Doris once stood to cast me out. But I wasn't there to look down on anyone. I was there to oversee the foundation of the Haven. The Haven wasn't just a new name. It was a new philosophy. We began constructing a sanctuary that utilized every unique gift our people possessed. Nora, the crystal wolf, used her ability to grow structural quartz that reinforced our homes, making them nearly indestructible. Maria, the shadow wolf, established a network of silent paths, allowing us to move through the forest unseen to protect our borders from external threats. Even the duds, those who couldn't shift at all, were honored as the keepers of lore and the architects of our new trade system. Educational note. This is a lesson in biological diversity. In nature, an ecosystem with only one type of plant will eventually die out. It is the variety of species that makes a forest resilient. By embracing our differences, we didn't just become kinder. We became the most powerful pack in the American Northwest. Doris's resolution was the most talked about part of our new law. I didn't send her to a cell. Instead, she was assigned to the nursery of new light. Her job was to care for the hybrid pups, the very children she once called stains. At first, she wouldn't look them in the eye. But slowly, the walls of iron around her heart began to crack. I watched from a distance as she held a young pup whose fur shimmered with a faint, uncontrollable fire, the same fire she had spent her life fearing. For the first time, she didn't recoil. She simply wrapped him in a blanket and whispered, "It's okay. You're exactly who you're supposed to be." The romance. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Ether Heights, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised gold, the pack gathered for the ceremony of choice. In the old ways, mates were often decided by the alpha or by a chemical bond that gave the female no say. But Edward and I wanted something different. We stood by the Great Falls, the mist turning into a rainbow in the fading light. Edward looked at me. His massive frame draped in dark, elegant leathers that matched his direwolf heritage. He took my hands in his skin cool like a mountain breeze, mine warm like a summer afternoon. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying over the roar of the water. "I don't choose you because the moon told me to. I don't choose you because our powers match. I chose you because you saw my scars and called them beautiful. I choose you as my partner, my equal, and my home." I felt the phoenix fire within me pulse not with the erratic heat of a curse, but with the steady glow of a heart that was finally safe. "And I choose you, Edward. Not because I need a protector, but because I found a partner who isn't afraid of my light." We didn't need silver chains or ancient vows. We simply leaned into each other, a perfect union of fire and storm. As we kissed, my wings unfurled, glowing with a soft, iridescent light that illuminated the entire valley. The pack didn't bow, they cheered. They cheered for a future where love was a choice and difference was a superpower. I started this journey as a girl who felt like a mistake, a cursed hybrid thrown to the wolves. But I realized that you can't be broken if you were never meant to fit into their box. I am Elizabeth. I am a phoenix goddess. And in my haven, everyone is legendary. The air in the clearing didn't just feel still. It felt frozen, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to hear the secrets that had been buried for centuries. This is the moment where the story shifts from a battle of strength to a battle of history. As I stood before the pack, the golden light from my wings began to pulse in time with the heartbeat of the earth. Lisa stepped forward, holding a charred ancient scroll that Doris had tried to burn years ago. "The pack has been told a lie," Lisa's voice rang out, steady and piercing. "You were taught that the phoenix was a mutation, a curse, that threatened the wolf bloodline. But look at the ancient carvings on the founding stones." She pointed to the monoliths behind the high ledge. Under the layers of moss and the deliberate scratches made by Doris's ancestors, the truth was revealed. The original alphas weren't just wolves. They were starbound hybrids. The phoenix wasn't an intruder. It was the source of the Alpha's power. The revelation. Generations ago, Doris's ancestors, who were physically strong but lacked the spiritual fire of the phoenix, staged a bloody coup. They realized they couldn't control the celestial fire, so they rebranded it as a disease to justify hunting the original royal line. They didn't save the pack from a curse. They stole a kingdom and turned its protectors into pariahs. Twist 2. The mirror of shame, the internal war. I turned my gaze to Doris. She wasn't snarling anymore. She was trembling, her eyes darting to her own reflection in the puddles of melted snow. "You didn't hate me because I was broken, Doris," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than a shout. "You hated me because I was a mirror." I stepped closer, the heat from my skin causing the iron jewelry on her neck to glow. "All those years you spent preaching purity, you were really trying to drown out the sound of your own soul. You have the phoenix spark too, don't you? Hidden under layers of iron and bitterness." The final blow. I reached out and touched her shoulder. My fire didn't burn her. It acted as a catalyst. Suddenly, a faint, flickering orange light began to glow beneath Doris's skin. It was weak, stunted by years of self-hatred and suppression, but it was there. Doris collapsed to her knees, sobbing. The mirror of shame was complete. The villain wasn't just an enemy. She was a woman who had spent her entire life trying to kill the best part of herself because she was told it made her impure. She had projected her own internalized shame onto me, Maria, Nora, and every other hybrid because if we were cursed, then she didn't have to admit she was different too. This is a powerful lesson in projective identification. Often, the people who judge others most harshly are actually struggling with the very same traits within themselves. Doris's purity code was a psychological shield to prevent her from ever having to face her own true identity. As the pack watched their matriarch glow with the very curse she had used to exile me, the walls of the purity movement didn't just fall, they evaporated. The truth was out. We weren't hybrids because something went wrong. We were hybrids because we were finally coming back to who we were always meant to be. The atmosphere in the Grey Ridge village was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. Centered in the ritual square, Nora and Maria were chained to the jagged basalt stones, their eyes wide with the terror of the impending purity purge. Doris stood over them, her iron-gray wolf form massive and imposing, her claws unsheathed. "For the strength of the pack," Doris howled, her voice a command that demanded blood. As she lunged, the sky didn't just break, it shattered. A pillar of blinding, liquid gold fire struck the earth between Doris and the captives. The force didn't explode outward, it imploded, pulling the oxygen from the air and replacing it with divine heat. As the smoke cleared, I was there. My wings were no longer just a part of me. They were a part of the sky, spanning wide and shimmering with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't snarl. I simply stood with my palms open. "Enough," I said. The word wasn't a shout, yet it vibrated through the marrow of every wolf present, amplified by the unseen presence of Elaine and Laurie, the divine guardians. Doris snarled, her eyes bloodshot with rage. "Kill her. Destroy the abomination." The purity guards charged, their silver-tipped spears leveled at my heart. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Instead, I channeled the core of my phoenix fire not into a flame to burn, but into a shield of grace. A dome of iridescent, warm light expanded from my chest. When the guards' spears struck the shield, they didn't shatter. They began to glow white-hot and soften. In seconds, the cold iron and silver melted, dripping onto the snow as harmless, cooling liquid. The guards stumbled back, their hands empty, their weapons gone. You speak of purity, I addressed the pack, my voice resonating with an authority that dwarfed Doris's fear-mongering. But you are destroying the very diversity that allowed our ancestors to survive the great winters. You are killing your future to protect a lie. I looked directly at Doris, who was recoiling from the radiant warmth. The curse you fear isn't in my blood, Doris. It's in your heart. It's the fear that if we are all different, you can no longer be the one who decides who is worthy. The divine guardians appeared as shimmering silhouettes of starlight behind me, their presence casting long, truth-revealing shadows across the square. In that light, the pack saw the hybrids not as monsters, but as children. They saw Nora's crystal for not as a defect, but as a miracle. One by one, the wolves who had been holding stones and spears let them fall. The clatter of iron hitting the ground was the loudest sound in the world. They didn't move to attack. They moved to embrace. Parents ran to their impure children. Warriors turned their backs on Doris to shield the captives. The purity movement didn't die by the sword, it dissolved in the light of the truth. I looked at Edward, who stood at the edge of the square, his storm eyes soft with pride. We hadn't just won a fight, we had reclaimed a soul. The embers of the old world have finally cooled, leaving behind a soil that is rich, fertile, and ready for something new. Elizabeth didn't just return to take her throne. She returned to burn the throne down and build a table where everyone could sit. She proved that the very thing they exiled her for, that searing misunderstood heat, was the only thing capable of melting the icy walls Doris had built around their hearts. As the moon rises over the newly christened haven, Elizabeth and Edward stand together on the ridge. Looking out over their pack, they no longer see a hierarchy of pure or defective. They see a family defined by its courage to be different. They see Nora's crystal light guiding the way and Maria's shadows protecting the weak. They see a community that stopped asking, "What are you?" and started asking, "How can we grow together?" Thank you for walking through the fire with us today. This story is a reminder that the world will often try to label your power as a problem because they aren't ready for your light. But remember, your uniqueness isn't a curse. It's your wings. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Before you go, I want to say a massive thank you for being part of this journey. Your time and your energy mean the world to me. If Elizabeth's transformation touched your heart, please help us reach more people by hitting that subscribe button, smashing the like, and leaving a comment below telling us where you're watching from. I'll be jumping into the comments to say hello because I love knowing how far these stories travel. Subscribe for more legendary transformations and stories of the champions who refuse to stay down. Until next time, keep your fire burning bright. Good night.